start by having a conversation with Bret and then open it up to questions. And you're always welcome to put things in the chat if you think of them before the Q&A. But I am not talented enough to read and have a conversation at the same time. So I won't look at that until it's time for the actual Q&A. So Bret, I'm just going to start by asking you, we've had these conversations before about, why Jews need democracy, but also why democracy needs Jews. And I don't think, talk enough about the importance to democracy that Jews present. What are your thoughts?
When we use the term democracy, Pamela, and thanks for having me on this chat. It's always nice to see friends. When we use the term democracy, I think we should be clear about exactly what we're saying, which is we're speaking about liberal democracy. There are forms of democracy which are not liberal. There's a fair case to make that Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey is democratically elected, but he's not really running what you or I would consider a democratic state. He's, or at least a liberal democracy. He's running a kind of a strongman dictatorship that happens to be popular. Something similar can be said about Orban in Hungary, and maybe even Putin in Russia, although that's a bit of a closer call. We're speaking about liberal democracy, which is both the institutions of representative government, and also the values of liberalism, which I know that you and David have been such champions of. What are those values? Tolerance, a belief in the open society, a belief in the value of free speech and dissent, pluralism, the conviction that no one person is entirely in possession of the truth, and that no one should be, right? I mean, that's not how societies progress. So that's what we're speaking about here, liberal democracy. Now, why do Jews need liberal democracy? Because any minority, but particularly successful minorities, especially minorities that achieve economic success, and I don't just mean Jews, say in Europe or the United States. You can point to Indian communities in the Indian diaspora. Uganda in the late 1960s is a good example, or the Chinese diaspora in Indonesia, need to exist in societies where their rights as a minority are going to be respected. So Jews have only been able to thrive in the diaspora where there has been not just democracy, but there has been liberalism. There has been respect for the rights of the few, irrespective of the wishes of the many. Now, the really interesting question that you're asking is why democracy, why liberal democracy needs Jews. And of course, I should preface this by saying liberal democracy needs all kinds of minorities. Liberal democracy needs all kinds of viewpoints, not just the Jews. But since I'm Jewish, I'm going to speak to that point in particular, which is that liberal democracy needs, in a sense, gadflies. It needs activists and dissenters. It needs people with opposing points of view, or at least people who are capable of saying yes, but. That is to say that there is no free society that is going to be a vibrant free society unless it has an active culture of disagreement. I gave a speech about 4 years ago called The Dying Art of Disagreement. And Jews, by nature of their history, their experience, their religious convictions, their belief and argument for the sake of heaven, have often provided in societies throughout history that quality of consistent and high-level dissent. And if you want to look at American history, ever heard of Samuel Gompers, the great American labor leader? his name was Gumperz, a great dissenter. Think of Harvey Milk, the first elected gay official in California. Think of some of the founders of the NAACP, the non-African American founders. Many of them, like Joel Spingarn, were Jewish. And so this has been a function that, if you can think of communities in functionalist terms, and you can't do it strictly, but this has been a function that I think Jews have very usefully played in American life, in the life of a liberal democracy. They have been, in a sense, the gadflies or the flies in the ointment. They have been the consistent voice of questioning and sometimes refusal. And societies which are led by majorities desperately need that voice of questioning and refusal. So that is a long answer to, I think, a really interesting question.
Well, and also, in the piece that you referenced, The Dying Art of Disagreement, you talk about how Republicans have become more right-leaning and Democrats have become more left-leaning, and each sees the other more increasingly, each sees the other as a threat. And what you're talking about is embracing a kind of disagreement, which we're clearly moving away from the concept that disagreement is useful for democracy. What do you see as yeah, go ahead.
Well, what I think has happened in the United States is we've become much more tribal. That is to say, if you are a Republican, you're a Republican sort of down the line. You always vote straight Republican ticket, and you would never consider voting for a Democrat. You will vote for a Republican even if he makes you sick or she makes you sick, depending on the gender of the candidate. And you will increasingly look at the Democratic side with suspicion bordering on enmity. And there's a mirror effect too, I think, increasingly on the left. There are fewer and fewer people, at least in my experience, I don't know about yours, but at least in my experience, who are prepared to kind of think for themselves, take a middle position, not demonize the other side, or if they do disagree with them, be able to disagree agreeably, be able to disagree and say, but there is still room for common ground. It's a weird thing that's happened in American society, in which the center has become the dangerous territory of US politics. It used to be the case that the dangerous territory was to be on the fringe. If you were a communist, that was dangerous territory. And if you were a John Bircher, that was also dangerous territory. The nature of American democracy, in part because of the two-party system, the way in which the Electoral College works, was constructed in such a way that the fringes tended to bend towards the center. We have now reached a point, for a variety of simple and complex reasons, where the center bends towards the fringe. And it is difficult to be a person who is able to say, I object to this and this on the right, I object to this and this on the left, and at the same time agree with some of this and some of the other. It's difficult to be that animal that has lost sight of his herd, or its herd, or whatever. And I think that is actually the function. Again, I shouldn't speak of groups as having performed functions, and I'm conscious of that. But that is, I think, a role that Jewish intellectuals, Jewish public thinkers, I think, are uniquely disposed to play, right? As the kind of the permanent outsiders, as people who are aware that there is fascism on both ends of the political spectrum, and that we need a vibrant liberal democracy that holds its center.
So one of the things that we're seeing in the Jewish community is a kind of a rift between those who want to perform that function, those who are more tethered to liberal values than to a party or to an ideology. And then the typical sort of progressive tribe that Jews have often belonged to. Jews are on average much more left leaning than the rest of the country. So what how do we have the conversations within the Jewish community to to help? There's hi.
Hi.
To help bring the understanding to those who are, sort of subscribing to a more tribal, progressive view.
So, look, there's a wonderful passage in a memoir that I treasured when I read it about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was still sort of firmly in the Republican camp. And it was a memoir by a German historian named Joachim Fest. Fest became famous as the first German to write a serious biography of Hitler, a post-war biography of Hitler. But he had had an extraordinary childhood. Born, I think, in 1924 or 5, grew up in Berlin, the son of a headmaster of a gymnasium of a Prussian Catholic nationalist family that nonetheless remained profoundly anti-Nazi. And the memoir is really an homage to Fest's father, who lost everything because he refused to do a Hitler salute. He refused to bend a knee in any respect to the regime. He was a great admirer and friend of Jews, of German Jews. And there's a beautiful line in which Fest quotes his father talking about the tragedy of Germany's Jews. And the father says something like, the Jews were the exemplary Germans. They had they'd been the most brilliant in adopting German culture, in assimilating to German ways. They had the greatest wit. They were he called them the ideal Prussians. It now sounds bizarre to think of someone as ideal Prussian as a compliment, but that was the view. And then the father says they had just one flaw, which is that having grown up in tolerant, liberal Prussia, they had lost their instinct for danger, which had preserved them through the ages. I think I'm quoting that from memory. And my impression, I think, again, I'm painting with a broad brush, but my impression of German Jews is we've lost our instinct for danger. Of American Jews, is we have, in many respects, lost our instinct for danger. We have had, with a few blips here and there, Father Coughlin and the McCarthy period, we have had a century of remarkable assimilation success and acceptance in American life. And suddenly, in the last few years, that has changed very dramatically. And it changed in some ways quite visibly on the right with the advent of this kind of new populism on the right, which shades into kind of fascistic themes. But it's happened, in my view, even in a more pronounced way on the left, except that on the left, it is somewhat disguised by the term anti-Zionism. I see anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as effectively identical phenomena. Not quite identical, but if you were to draw a Venn diagram, the two circles would nearly completely overlap. But because of this semantic difference, I think a great many Jews long at home in a sort of comfortably liberal world have lost the instinct for danger of seeing what is profoundly amiss on the leftward side of the aisle, among their friends in the world of liberals and progressives. And that is really what I think deeply concerns me. I think people have to become increasingly alert. Jews in America have to become increasingly alert that some of the tropes that now dominate discourse on the left, especially the trope about privilege, is a half step away from virulent anti-Semitism. Because if we're going to talk about privilege in society, if we're going to treat success as inherently suspect, as unjust as opposed to earned, then we're going to run into some serious problems.
Yeah, we've talked about this, and there have been several articles in the journal that you are the editor-in-chief for Sapir,
right?
Including my own, that talk about the this sort of inversion, whereby Jews being designated as white then are tagged with a privilege that, if you called it Jewish privilege, would be seen for what it is, a kind of anti-Semitism. But by calling it, by designating Jews as white, it takes that, it sort of disguises it. And then the problem really with all of the these tropes are translated onto white people the same way that they are used in anti-Semitic slurs against Jews, so that then Jews become white, and white people are, the problem with white people is that they're like Jews.
You mean yes, exactly. So I think that there are four things that have happened in American society in the last few years, in American culture or high culture, that are uniquely dangerous to Jews. The first is that ethnicity has given way to race as the primary marker of identification. We used to be Polish, German, Jewish, Chinese, Mexican, lots of different ethnicities, all of whom faced one common enemy, and those were the WASPs, right? I say that in somewhat in jest, but there was WASP culture, which was the dominant culture, and then there were a lot of ethnicities, and Jews were just one ethnicity that was routinely discriminated against in all kinds of ways. Alan can speak to this and has spoken to this far more eloquently than I ever could. There was redlining, there was no hire policies, so forth and so on. That ended, or largely ended, I think, in the last 50 years or so. But in its place, race has become the primary marker. And so Jews have been shunted, unless you happen to be a Jew of color, right? Jews have been shunted into a racial identity that we have never considered our own. Jews have never thought of themselves as white. If anything, it was because we were insufficiently white that 6 million of us were murdered within living memory 80 or so years ago. So that's the first thing. Ethnicity has given way to race. The second thing is that success has given way to privilege. One of the things that distinguishes the United States from, I think, every other society in which Jews have had a presence is that in America, the more successful Jews became, the more tolerant people became of them, the more assimilated they were, the more accepted they were in society. Success in the American context did not beget envy, and therefore did not beget discrimination. You look at Europe, whenever Jews rose, whenever it was in Austria or Germany or France, inevitably it led to the rise of explicitly anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish factions or parties, and then wound up in pogroms and ghettos and other forms of discrimination. So now something has turned in American life, where instead of looking at success as a mark of merit, right, which is the old Calvinist thought. When the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth in 1620, they believed in this deeply Calvinist idea that success was a mark of God's favor, right? And there's been a through line of this in American society, ever in the 400 years since then. Now suddenly success is privilege. And if you have privilege, you should feel guilty for it, and you probably didn't earn it fairly. In fact, you probably took it from someone else. And you have to return it not simply in the form of taxation, but you have to return it in the form of essentially evicting yourself from the places that you've attained in some way. So that's the next thing. The third aspect is the way in which individual and independent thought has become heresy. And that's, again, a really important fact. We used to be a society that loved the gadfly. It loved the guy who said no when everyone else said yes. The hero, 12 Angry Men. You think of all sorts of stories, like touchstone stories in American life, and it's always about the lone outsider who has the guts to dissent, right? And in doing so becomes the moral, the hero of the story. American culture always prized that. Now, the person who is the dissenter has become a heretic, and there are whole fields of thought and inquiry which are now effectively off limits. They are a kind of kill zone for the independent thinker. If the independent thinker is asking, well, what is the role of culture, for instance, cultural norms in terms of successful outcomes for different kinds of groups, that's a no-go zone. You're going to get killed if you go there. You can think of all kinds of other topics which have become no-go areas. So for Jews who have always been fond of going into those zones of intellectual danger, that too is something that has changed and has made modern American liberalism much less hospitable to Jews. And the final point, sorry for going on for so long, but the final point is that conspiracy theories have become dominant, have increasingly begun to dominate the thinking of both sides of the American political spectrum. Whether it's this conviction that we are utterly dominated by a deep state, and you absolutely cannot trust any system or society and government. I'm not saying you have to trust them, but it's the insistence that they're all untrustworthy. There's always a different story. Or frankly, on the left, Russiagate. What was Russiagate? Russiagate was a gigantic conspiracy theory that had a sort of a gloss of plausibility, which then quickly folded when Robert Mueller took a close look at things, right? But to this day, there are people who will tell you with absolute certainty that they just know that there was collusion between Trump and Putin. There are all kinds of ways in which you can indict Trump. No one was more critical of Trump, I think, than I was. But that was a conspiracy theory, which millions of Americans fell for. Now, what is the greatest conspiracy theory in the world? I mean, this is a point I think you've made very eloquently, Pamela. Anti-Semitism is the greatest conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory about Jews that holds that Jews are imposters and swindlers, right? It says that the Jew who is in Europe and claims to be German or French or Austrian or Italian or English is none of those things. He's in fact a Semite. He is from a different place. And he is a swindler because he has come from a different place and he's there to swindle you out of your patrimony. That is the anti-Semitic allegation in a nutshell. What is anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism is the conspiracy theory that Jews are imposters and swindlers. They are imposters in the sense that they claim to be from the land of Israel or Palestine, but in fact, they're just expatriated Galicians and Poles or Europeans. And they're swindlers because they're trying to swindle the Palestinian people or the Arab people out of their land. So it's another conspiracy theory. And this is a point I make in a forthcoming essay in Sapir. If Americans are prepared to believe anything about anything, they will eventually believe the worst about Jews. And that's the fourth element that I think makes this such a moment of real danger for 21st century American Jews.
Well, on that happy note, here's
I think Alan is trying to. Alan, you have to unmute yourself.
Oh, Alan? Do you have a comment here? Can you unmute yourself, Alan?
I did.
There you go.
Okay. Hi. Well, that was brilliant. All of your analyses have been brilliant. I just wanted to add one thing. I completely agree with Bret that Jews have lost their instinct for self-defense, but I think the reasons are somewhat more complicated and seductive. One of the reasons we've lost our willingness to those who are conservative, many have lost their willingness to be critical of the right because the right has become so supportive of Israel. And it's awfully hard for people to criticize somebody when they're the only people who are now supporting Israel, and if they're Jewish. And so if you're a real Zionist, you're likely to buy the whole hog, to use a bad metaphor for Jews, but you're likely to buy into the, no good Scotsman theory. No good Scotsman doesn't do that. And so you get the ZOA approach, where the Zionist Organization of America buys everything, and they buy into the entire right-wing agenda because they're so supportive of Israel. And people like us, we can't do that. We can't buy into the whole right-wing agenda. We can't buy into the whole left-wing agenda. Many of us are social liberals. We support a woman's right to choose, and gay marriage, and transgender rights, and environmental rights, and gun control. But we can't buy into the other part of the no good Scotsman. If you're a good Scotsman, you must oppose Israel. And so we are stuck. We can't join the right, we can't join the left. And as Bret points out so accurately, there's no more middle. The only quarrel I have with him is he uses the word liberal as a foil. I think true liberals, I feel very comfortable with, and I suspect many of you feel very comfortable with true, genuine, tolerant liberals. It's the progressives and the radicals, but too many Jews who are by their nature centrists have been forced into becoming left-wing, accepting, anti-Israel, if not anti-Israel, at least quietly no longer pro-Israel, or also uncritical of the right. I mean, you saw the New York Times the other day editorialized against Mayim Bialik because she's too pro-Israel, and therefore maybe she can't become the person who runs the TV show Jeopardy. Kids in college are now kids in high school. I don't know if you know this. This would be an interesting article for you to write about. I've been told that kids going to very good high schools in New York are told by their college advisors, do not include the fact that you went to Israel for a year or 6 months. Do not include any pro-Israel activities. It will hurt your chances of getting into Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Columbia, etc. And that's, tragically become the reality. And there are, a dozen of us on this show. We may be half of the group in the country today that represents Jews that are critical both of right and left. And by the way, one of the reasons that the left has become this has been Donald Trump. The idea, and I experienced this personally, I was against Donald Trump. I voted against him twice. I don't like him. I don't like his philosophy. I don't like his approach, but I defended him and on constitutional grounds. And as the result of that, I've been canceled by the left, including the Jewish left. 92nd Street Y won't allow me to speak. Temple Emmanuel won't allow me to speak. Ramaz canceled a speech of mine. So it's not just left-wing organizations. It's mainstream Jewish organizations that doesn't like people who think for themselves, who wants you to pick sides. And that's the greatest tragedy, the picking sides.
You're pointing to something that's not unique to Jews. Bret was talking at the beginning, and maybe you can speak a little more to it, Bret, about the tribalization of the country. But with respect to Jews, Bret, what's the my question is, how do we speak across the lines? How do we engage across these lines of difference in ways in which we're not, as Jews, we have had the experience, and we have sort of the history of being the other, of being the stranger, of being being seen as with suspicion. And now we're doing that to one another.
So first of all, I endorse everything that Alan said. And it is true that the word liberal gets a lot of abuse. I think it's a atavism from spending 16 years at the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. So the point is well taken, Alan, and it's an important distinction to maintain between actual liberals who are capable of embracing the idea that they aren't in sole possession of the truth and believe in diversity of views and free expression, as opposed to progressives who are essentially our 21st century Marxists. I mean, they are reminiscent of the people who joined the Communist Party back in the 40s and 50s and believed that Joe Stalin represented the march of progress. And so that's very useful. I think the first thing, the first battle that has to be waged, maybe battle is the wrong word. The first conversations that really have to be had are within the Jewish community. And I understand, I had a conversation just yesterday with a friend of mine, very, very wise, highly literate Jewish woman, liberal politics, but very much a proud Jew. And she said something to the effect that, look, so long as Donald Trump and the Republican Party stand for the January 6th lie, right, there is no choice, right? To her, it was a purely binary situation where, again, you just had to be, it didn't matter what the left did. You had to be against the Republican Party because the Republican Party stood for Donald Trump, and Donald Trump stood for, not just his sort of brutish personality, but a kind of a fascism, a willingness to fundamentally question the tenets of a liberal democracy and call a legitimate election into question. And I obviously I kind of sympathize with that. And that's, I think, an acceptable point of view when you go into a voting booth and say, well, it's a choice I have to make, and I'm not going to vote in Elmo as my presidential candidate, right? You have to choose between the lesser of evils. That being said, politics is not simply the side you take when you vote in a presidential election. Politics is also what you do within your own party. Politics are the kind of candidates that you embrace in primaries, in congressional contests, and so on. Politics is a willingness to say, hey, I want someone like Ben Sasse to remain in the Republican Party because there's got to be a conservative party, and I'd rather have the Ben Sasses of the world represented than the Tom Cottons. And that's the kind of politics that Jews really need to wage, right? I've always believed that we have a particular responsibility, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, to police your own side. And because Jews have predominantly been on the left side, on the Democratic side, it is a unique responsibility of Jews to do that policing, to say, hey, we're proud Democrats, which means we're for the Steny Hoyers of the world, right? And other Democrats who have been clearly pro-Israel. But as proud Democrats, we are going to be the first ones to denounce the Ilhan Omars and the Ayan Presleys and the other characters, right, who are pro-Hamas. They are pro the party that wants to kill the Jews. And we want to, yes, expel them from the party, of course, by political means, by electoral means, by putting up better candidates in primaries, but we're going to do all of that. And so I don't think the case has to be made, hey, listen, this is a Manichaean contest to the death against the cult of Donald Trump and all that he represents, so you must vote the Democratic ticket. You can, in fact, be intelligent about it, right? You can promote a politics that understands that we need a healthy liberal center, right? We need a healthy Zionist left. We need champions who are non-insane, right? And we don't have to simply salute just because there's a D connected to a name on a ballot. So I think that's the kind of politics that have to be waged right now. And by the way, it especially has to happen in shuls. It has to happen in Jewish schools. Alan mentioned cancellation. The whole sort of train of like nonstop cancellation, which by the way happens on the right as well. Okay, it's not, I mean, I've been canceled on the right. I've been canceled on the left. I've been canceled on the right. But there's something Stalinist about that. There's something Stalinist about trying to besmirch people based on rumors in order to destroy them as human beings, in order to wreck their life's work. And that happens all the time. All the time. And the answer is, well, they'll be okay because they're rich or something, right? It's a horrendous, inhumane, anti-Judaic attitude. To destroy someone's reputation is evil if it's based on lies or hearsay or rumors.
To destroy someone's reputation is against Jewish law. But you brought up some things that bring me back to the Fest quote that you gave from memory about having lost the instinct for danger. One of the things that makes me think of two things. One is that that in a way we've also developed a tolerance for our own anxiety. Whereas Jews have a certain level of anxiety, probably a higher level of anxiety.
I have no anxieties, Pamela. I'm wholly non-neurotic.
And it perhaps on average, as a population, we may have a higher level of anxiety than non-Jews. But we have become sort of tolerant of our own anxiety to the extent that we no longer pay attention to it. We no longer use it as information. We sort of set it aside as, that's just the way we are. And so we have then lost, in a sense, the instinct for danger, as that quote made me think of that. And then the other part of it that you're talking about is being canceled, in your case from the right and the left, in Alan's case from the left. But the people who are willing to do what you're suggesting, to police your own side, right? The people who are willing to speak up and say something to our own side put a lot at risk. And we've also sort of lost the instinct for risk taking. And
it's true, and I understand that. Look, people develop. Not a lot of people are just sort of born to be dissenters and courageous. It's a certain kind of chutzpahdik personality, right? That it's not everyone, people like to belong to communities. It's what it goes very, very deep into not only human nature but probably animal nature. What I have found is that as I have become kind of out of sorts with both ends of the political spectrum, I found new friends. I found this kind of community of people who have in some ways fallen out and are at the margins. And then it turns out they're surprisingly numerous. And by the way, I think it's not only are they numerous, I think their numbers are going to grow. More and more people are going to be canceled. And they're, the cancel parties are going to grow larger. Second of all, people who fear being canceled, this is a point you've made, which I think is profound. It's not so much, there are only a handful of us who have been canceled, right? Or where real attempts have been made at cancellation. It's not the cancellation, it's the culture, right? It is the fear that you're going to be canceled that ensnares so many more people than the relatively limited number of people who have been canceled. Someone actually once made this point to me in the context of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin figured out something that Joe Stalin never knew. Joe Stalin thought, well, if I'm going to get rid of my enemies, I'm going to have to kill 1 million people or more, right? Vladimir Putin's genius is to say, well, let's say I want to get the journalists in line. I don't have to kill all the journalists. I have to kill the most important journalist, and then all the other journalists will fall into line. That's why Anna Politkovskaya is no longer alive. I don't have to kill all the political dissidents. I just have to get rid of one guy, whether it was, a few years ago, it was Nemtsov, and now it turns out there are more and more people, and he's not always successful at getting rid of them. But the idea is take one scalp that's so prominent that everyone else falls into line. And that's the nature of cancel culture. What is also happening, however, is that so many people kind of in the wider orbit who are feeling it's like you're not in Siberia, but you can feel the Siberian winds coming down your way, are beginning to quietly inhabit these new territories. I think that's why you see the rise of the Substack economy, and why so many people who have migrated from mainstream platforms to Substack suddenly have these really very considerable followings. It's why the topic of cancel culture is such a big one, right? I mean, it's not just, Alan Dershowitz got canceled, and Bret Weinstein, and, a handful of other people. People are consumed with this, right? Because they sense that if you can take down a Dershowitz or a Weinstein or a Stevens or whoever, then they're next in line. And so they're engaged in this. And the community of people, I think, that is engaged this way is really growing. So my pitch is, you know what? You're Jews anyway. You've always been on the outs. And now you can experience being on the outs of the outs and then finding a way of getting back in. And that's a kind of, in some ways, a deeply Jewish experience. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there you go.
It does. It's very it's interesting. It's a way of thinking that I hadn't considered, that sort of.
I mean, I think if you haven't been canceled in today's society, I mean, who the fuck are you? It's like like you're a nobody. What, you haven't been canceled, not even once?
But what do you say? What do you say people want to get back in? I surely don't want to get back in. I mean, it's taught me a tremendous lesson of who my friends are, who the real tolerant liberal people are. The last thing I want to do is get back in. I'm very proud of my status. I've always been an outsider, but as you say, for years I was getting honorary degrees because I was an outsider. Today I'm being banned in the same colleges that gave me honorary degrees, having done nothing different than I've done all of my life. I don't want to get back in.
So Alan,
there's a wonderful line where Baudelaire says to Manet, "I see, sir, that you have the honor of being hated."
Mm-hmm.
And I love that line. First of all, Manet is probably my favorite 19th century painter. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes it's an honor to be hated. I mean, ask yourself who your enemies are and say, would you want to spend 1 minute in the company of these schmucks? And that's, if the answer is no, well, then okay, so I'm just of the view that there's always been a kind of unseemly side to Jewish life. And by that, I mean the desperate desire to belong. If you want to belong, why remain a Jew? Become a Presbyterian.
Well, and that is what's happening, right? I mean, you yourself have talked about the diminished interest in Judaism and Jewish life of American Jews. And maybe part of that does have to do with this desire to belong, this desire to not be the eternal outsider, the desire to have that tribe instead of the tribe of misfits. Go ahead.
Look, I think it is hard to be a Jew. And I don't just mean this, in terms of Jewish learning and all the rest of it. I think it is hard to be a Jew because to be a Jew is to, at some level, renounce and forswear a promise of a certain kind of salvation. I mean, it's no secret, it's no accident that Christianity and Islam, which are essentially both not just sibling, but in some ways children of Judaism in terms of their monotheistic convictions, right, have succeeded precisely because there is that salvific promise. And Judaism has been a tough pill to swallow if the answer is, well, what happens afterwards? Nothing. You return to dust, right? There are no angels at the other end. You have this one life to lead. So the calling of Judaism, just from that standpoint, has, I think, always been a difficult one. I think it's more difficult precisely because it has always had that insistent quality of second guessing. It has always had that quality of being a nation that dwells apart, right? It is a lonely road to be a Jew. And I think it's one of the reasons why there are probably tens of millions of people whose ancestors were at some point Jews who just got off the bus, right? Because this was too hard in one way or another. It's not surprising that religion has lasted this long and still remains so underpopulated with people. It's bizarre in some respect. But I think it's also why it has produced such a disproportionate share of really extraordinary minds. Because it is this religion that is in the business of saying no. And that's, that's a particular kind of calling. But I would say to all of these, our Jewish friends who are so invested in wanting to participate, say, well, what is the point of your difference unless you're really prepared to be different? And what is difference really if it's just matzo balls, on religious occasions, or you can't even tell Woody Allen jokes because he's been forbidden, he's been canceled, or watch Woody Allen movies. What's the point of it? I think it's wonderful precisely because we've always been this. We are outcasts by nature. We are congenital dissidents, and I couldn't think of something better to be, but it just suits my nature.
Well, we have a little less than 15 minutes left, and so I want to make sure that people who want to get into the conversation have the opportunity. So if any of you want to just raise your hand or indicate to me in some way that you'd like to. I think Chris maybe would like to ask a question.
Well, I was just thinking, this idea of having a sense of the danger. I'm reading this book by Anthony Doerr, all the light we cannot see, and there's a blind girl who kind of smells the gasoline of the approaching Wehrmacht. That's as far as I am. So I assume that the Wehrmacht comes. But it's like, what is the smell of the gasoline that if we're attuned enough and sensitive enough, we can not only pick up, but then take action?
Well, that's a brilliant formulation of the question. And I don't have a clear answer. I would say this. I think there are envy cultures and there are admiration cultures. One of the reasons why the United States is so good for the Jews and really good for all strivers, right? I just wrote a column about Colin Powell,
Great column.
Thank you, and his Jamaican striving immigrant parents, So this is not just Jews alone. But the United States has largely had a culture that is defined by our instinct for admiration, right? I mean, Bill Gates or whoever, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, worth north of $100 billion, depending on their respective stock prices on any given day. And most of us don't think, why does that Schmendrick have $100 billion when I have, $10,000 or whatever it is in my checking account? We think he had a really good idea. I wish I had thought of it. I wish I had been smart enough in 1995 to think of e-commerce as a growth industry, or to think that there was a new way to put human beings into space or whatever, and could have made a fortune, right? And so American culture has for so long been defined by that admiration gene. We just have it, right? European culture, I mean, I lived in Europe a number of years. It's very different. Canada, by the way, the same thing. It's a tall poppy society. I think it's either Canadians or Australians use this tall poppy metaphor. The poppy that stands up above the rest. The instinct is chop it down, right? And when you think about it, envy and admiration are twins, right? It is just one's attitude towards the success of others, right? So I think the gasoline is that what has been happening in the last few years is that we are moving from an admiration society to an envy society, right? Why do you, whether you is defined as rich people or white people or Jews, have all this and we don't? And why did you take it from us, right? That's the kind of, not how did you achieve something that we can get to, but why did you take this from us and how can we get it back? So that to me seems like the gasoline. That's the early warning. Another metaphor is in the Cold War, you had this system of early warning radars, in Greenland and Baffin Island and places like that. And that's, I think, the early warning system of something really bad happening. I think there's another one that occurs to me, which is that we have become stunningly intolerant of certain kinds of slurs and stunningly tolerant of others, which is to say that you can get away with anti-Semitic slurs, culturally speaking, in a way that's not possible with anti-Black slurs or anti-Asian slurs or anti-transgender slurs. Now, I'm a kind of a free speech libertarian, so I think you should get away with all slurs, fucking Jews, whatever, go for it. That's my view is equal opportunity offense. It's a free society. Let's get over ourselves and make jokes at everyone's expense. Fine, that's one view. Another view is it's all mean and hateful. We should have no jokes based on ethnic stereotypes ever against anyone. But what you now have, and this is the kind of more like the gasoline smell in the air, is that when it comes to the anti-Jewish jokes, it's totally fine, right? Or the anti-Jewish slurs, it's totally fine. People get wrist slapped for that kind of behavior. Whereas if it's homophobic or if it's racist, it's total cancellation. So that's another indication that even according to the rules of hypersensitive wokeness, Jews are being put into a different category where it's okay to rag on the Jew in a way that it's not okay against some other minority.
Right.
That's another one.
It's considered punching up, right?
Right.
Right. And you're making me think of two things. The first is just to your point about getting away with anti-Semitic slurs. On Bill Maher, I think it was last Friday, there was a rapper who was talking about policing and was making the distinction between sort of community policing and the kind of policing that's like the IDF.
Mm-hmm.
And referring to, I don't remember what his words were exactly, but he was essentially referring to that conspiracy theory of the IDF training police officers in how to mistreat Black people.
Yeah.
And it did not get a peep not only from anybody at the show, but afterwards, I saw no chatter about it on social media, not a peep.
I'm a little surprised there because actually Bill Maher is terrific when it comes not only to being anti-woke, anti-PC, but also being pro-Israel.
I know, but I think this just slipped under the radar. So that's the first thing. Then the second thing is when you're talking about envy culture and admiration culture, it made me think of something else you've written, which is about times in history when the those in power are the young and times when those in power are the elders. And I wonder if there is a relationship between envy and admiration and the youth in power and the elders in power.
I didn't quite understand what you were driving at.
You wrote something, and I can't remember exactly what you said about there are times in history when the
Yes,
culture is in the, you know what I'm saying.
when you're a columnist, the biggest problem is you can't remember a damn thing you
Right.
wrote. And then people will tell you, "Oh, you wrote that column," and you think, "I did." When you're just frantically on deadline trying to punch something out.
But it makes me think that, when that envy is more of a youth thing, right? And admiration is something that you have more sort of wisdom when you're in that. I don't know, maybe I'm
not sure that's right. I mean, I know very envious elderly people and admiring younger people. I mean, I think that
I'd have to wave.
I'm not sure that's true. It is true that we live. Now you're reminding me of the column. My point was that there are decades where the old rule the young, and there are decades when the young rule the old. The old ruled the young in the 1950s, and by the late 60s, as far as I can tell, that had flipped. And it is true that we live in a culture in which the moral tone is set by is typically set by younger people, and older people are sort of keep silent or kind of nervously scamper about. At least that's my observation of some places. It's an interesting question, like how that affects the Jews, except in this, maybe I think in a historical sense, which is that if you have something like a historical memory, you are more likely to understand that for the first many decades of its existence, the idea of wiping Israel off the map wasn't just a desire, it was a very realistic possibility. And that the manner in which Israel came to acquire the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai and the Golan Heights in 1967 was as a result of a conflict it did not seek, and in which its survival was at stake. And so I think older people, I mean, I was born in 1973, so after the 67 war, but I kind of grew up knowing this and then studying it in greater depth. The experience of the young is sort of looking at television and being fed a series of half-truths about the nature of the conflict, half-truths at best, in which the defining aspect of it is, the occupation. And there are many things to be said against the occupation, by the way, but the idea that it came about through avarice and ill will by Israel is simply false. It came about because Israel was fighting for its life, and because it was attacked in an unprovoked way by Jordan, in 67. And that's very, very difficult to communicate to people who don't even have a memory of 9/11, much less of earlier conflicts. So that, I think, is sort of problematic in terms of the conflict. The other aspect of this is that I think it's harder if you're young to really understand that Zionism is a liberation movement. Right. And that without Zionism, Jews in the world would be, in my view, in a much more desperate place than they are today. I think that to the extent that There is some security, first of all, security for millions of Jews who were able to flee to Israel, all the Russian Jews, all the Sephardic Jews, all the Persian Jews, South American Jews, and so on, Libyans, Moroccans, and so on. But we would be in a more precarious place also because Israel represents a pole of actual power that at least some people really respect, and that has changed the nature of Jewish identity and Jewish self-respect in a profound sense. Jews became enamored of powerlessness. Jews love the idea. I mean, Dara Horn has this book, which I'm supposed to read soon, People Love Dead Jews, which has a kind of a brilliantly double-edged quality. But Jews become too infatuated with the idea that if you're powerless, you are morally stainless. That's not true. Powerlessness also leads to cowardice. It leads to making concessions to bullies and to oppressors just because you want to survive. It leads to a kind of a crippling quality of living in shadows and living in fear. And those are not virtues in my book. If you want to be, Jews are the chosen people, according to some sources. But it would be nice to be a choosing people. And the moral life requires choice. And what Israel uniquely has provided at the highest level, that is to say a sovereign level, is the possibility of Jewish choice in the world. That's a big deal. That's really important to the Jews. And, I don't want to be able to say, I don't want to feel virtuous because someone tried to kill my mother in Nazi-occupied Europe. That's not what I rest my moral case on. The fact that we were nearly annihilated, and in some ways, in some places like in Latvia, annihilated for being Jews. I'd like to think that it also means that I belong to a people that's capable of self-respect and self-preservation. And that's a lesson that I think is difficult to make for younger people in a culture that is saturated with the idea that the victim is always right.
I think you've just summed up one of the ways in which democracy needs Jews, in that is a fundamental insight that our democracy needs right now. That we need to make moral choices, and that victimhood does not bestow moral blamelessness.
Well, that's exactly it. And victimhood often, and chosen victimhood, right, I think is particularly problematic, to use a term that's popular these days. One of the things, I used to give speeches in the pre-COVID world, there were always occasions to give speeches to Jewish audiences. And there was one setup which used to drive me bananas. And it was, there was a period of time when Sderot was under constant rocket fire. And you'd go, and it was some Jewish charity, and they would advertise how proud they were that they had built a concrete, they built a basketball arena for the teenagers of Sderot, that they could play basketball behind 4 feet of reinforced concrete. And how great was that? And it drove me nuts, right? Because the idea of Israel is not to showcase Jewish victimization. The idea of Israel is to end Jewish victimization. So these organizations were replicating the kind of mentality that Israel was supposed to bring an end to. The right mentality is to say what is happening in Sderot is an absolute outrage, and the state of Israel is going to do everything to end it, end the firing of missiles, not merely avert those missiles reaching their destination. And that's a point for probably a different argument.
Well, I know that we've gone just a few minutes over, so I thank you very much for your time. And this has been such a great conversation. And thank you, Alan, too, for your in-depth participation. I hope those of you who didn't get a chance to participate or ask questions will come to the next one. Hopefully we'll have another.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and nice to see you all.
Thank you very much. And thank you all.